Hey there, in this video, I'm going to be discussing startup research. So how is startup research conducted? Well, when they want to figure out what's happening inside of startups, they will interview the founders and engineers. They'll do systematic mapping studies, which means looking at previous research to find new conclusions. For example, on the Source 3, looking at all of the startup research and then trying to find specifically software development related research. They also collect data on managerial practices used at startups, so how do they manage the people, and also collecting data on software development practices at startups, such as how do they actually make the product or the website, whatever the startup is. Something I found in the research process is that a significant amount of the research relies on asking questions to engineers, founders, whoever, right? And that data can become biased just because you're asking a person. And there's even a research quote here that says a possible risk here is bias in data. The interviewee might focus on the most improvised or messy aspects of the product development. The underlying meaning of this is saying that they will tell you about the bad stuff that happened, even if 90% of the product development process at a startup is actually good. They'll only remember the bad things, and so you can kind of get a biased response from an interviewee. So there is one large main flaw across all startup research when I look at it myself, and it's this. I'll show you a quote from a research paper. There is no unique definition in literature on what constitutes a startup. The inconsistent use of the term startup by different authors and lacking description of context restrains the creation of a coherent body of knowledge on software startups. So this was actually in a research paper, and he's acknowledging that when we look at startups, when we say, I do this research and I come to a conclusion based off my questions I asked people, for example, and then you try and say, this is the knowledge that applies to startups. Well, that doesn't really make any sense because what is a startup? Every single research paper seems to have a different definition, a different type of definition. There is no clear startup definition for saying it has to be within this revenue range, it has to have this employee count. There is nothing like that in the realm of startup research currently, and it becomes a problem when you try to look at other research and apply it to your own. So in that same vein, I'm going to ask, are these startups the same? We have Startup A, which is a side project by a software engineer at Apple, so pretty capable software engineer. He has a 50-50 ownership split with his only business partner, so there's only two people in the company, and they have no outside funding, and they just fund these servers themselves. And then Startup B is a project started by previously successful tech entrepreneurs, and they have a large board that shares ownership alongside high-value employees, and let's just say 30 million in venture capital funding. Are these startups the same? You'd probably say no, but the interesting thing here is that these are both labeled startups. They're both companies that are not public, and they have some funding internally, and they technically have employees. And let's just say technically their products are high risk and they're entering a market and they're most likely to fail. So they're both startups. So this brings in another question. Do you think that the advice that applies to Startup A, the side project, would similarly apply to Startup B, a highly funded project with significant board and employees? The answer there is most likely no. The advice cannot be applied similarly. Every single startup is unique, and when the research is so vague, it's hard to come to conclusions that apply to all of these different startup companies and all their different situations. Some factors that you saw in the previous examples when wanting to apply the actual findings of research advice are yearly revenue or profit, the number of employees, the technical expertise of employees, so that's more in the software engineering realm, but also technical expertise of founders and founding companies, the founders' connections to others in the industry, and then the current stage of a product. So for example, is a product just an idea? Or do you already have some fully developed systems? Do you already have a small version release that a lot of people like? Then you might be more likely to invest heavily in the funding so you make it better, for example. If it's just an idea and you have no validation, there's a different mindset there when it comes to investing heavily in that idea. So this lack of definition brings in even more issues when you start to apply to niche research areas, not just the broad startup research, but also like startup software development practices, startup managerial practices, startup pivots, changing your idea or your market. When you get into these niche categories, a startup pivot for a $30 million funded company, for example, is going to be way different than just two guys being like, and we only put it like $1,000 into this, let's change our idea. It's a completely different idea of how you would change a pivot. As you can imagine, if you invested $10 million into an idea and it didn't work out, changing to pivot to a new product where your $10 million is wasted would be a completely different decision, like I said before, than the two guys just changing their idea because they're not passionate about it anymore, right? So that lack of definition is just one of the main ways that startup research is flawed, but they still are able to find some conclusions, at least isolated to the people they asked and their own research processes. So you can still ask 40 startups, and you're probably going to see correlations, which are great to use. And so you do find that, right? The main problem in startup research is your research going to be applicable to other startup research? That's kind of one of the larger questions where even the researchers themselves acknowledge that sometimes the startups they are interviewing can be so different in how they're structured, so different in how much funding they have, and things like that. So just to go through some conclusions, we see that software startup teams should gather maximum knowledge and consider failure as an opportunity to obtain validated learning. This was in a paper that discussed how to actually pivot a startup. And it pretty much said that you want to gain as much knowledge as you can from every single mistake you make. So you know that if you keep making the same mistake, you can then pivot your product or pivot your market to stop making those mistakes. And that also ties into the idea that you have to know as much as possible about the mistakes you're making to make a good decision. So the second bullet point found that it was found in most software startups, the product idea commonly originates from the founder. So this is a great example of something that is completely kind of neutral. They would ask the interviewers like who came up with the idea, and they would say the founder. So this is like completely neutral, and also another good example of how this advice might be unique to the companies they were asking, for example. Then this last bullet point is pretty interesting. It says that startups have higher maturity in their development, also present higher maturity in relation to the use of best practices, methods, and tools of knowledge management. I really like this point at the end here because it actually discusses startup maturity. This isn't something that is discussed in all different aspects of startup research. And I think it was really interesting of them to actually say, okay, we're obviously interviewing startups that are in different places, different stages, and how developed their products are, how, strong of a system they have internally. And so it kind of acknowledges that when you have that higher startup maturity, you're also going to have a higher use of using those best practices and methods and tools for knowledge management specifically here, but you could also imagine this claim might be able to be researched for different areas as well, outside of just knowledge management. So some questions that I kind of came up with here when discussing, okay, we have an idea of what startup research is, we have an idea of why it's flawed. And so how can we make some questions to kind of address these flaws and also address different parts of the industry? So I'll just go through these. So the first one is, why are these companies selecting to interview with researchers? The main goal of startups is to generally create a fantastic product as fast as possible. So why waste time doing interviews? This is something I've definitely experienced working in a startup myself. If someone were to email my founder and actually ask him, hey, is it cool if we interview your engineers? That guy is almost 100% getting a no, because the engineer's time is very valuable. And it's also important to recognize that when I'm on company time, I'm working for the product and they want to see a development of the product or a development of the software engineering side, at least from my perspective. And so it definitely brings in the question of, why are these startups opting to do the research interviews, especially when startups can be such a fierce and competitive market. The second bullet point discussing how is it possible to gain more information on the startups you're interviewing to come to more accurate claims, possibly taking into account funding, employee count, or revenue. So just having some extra markers on different companies might make it easier to see how a high revenue versus a low revenue company operates, for example. And is the research behind both of those different types of companies the exact same? I personally would doubt it. So I think that's would be a really great thing to actually look into, is how do, high revenue versus low revenue, or high employee count, low employee count, how do those different factors result in different answers to your research question? And the last bullet point here is discussing how can we create research specifically in the realm of software development in startups, especially with a current lack of software development research in the industry. A systematic mapping study actually found out that a very small percentage of all startup research currently available lacks software development research. So in understanding this, I think it would be really interesting to look into the actual software development processes of these startups and not just asking them basic things like, do you use agile or lean management, for example? So actually getting to the fundamental thing, which would be how do you actually create whatever you're trying to create? And these are all the different works cited I had shown here. So there you go. Thanks for watching.